elle est en place. C'est la poudre.
Tiens, on a découpé une femme en morceaux rue de la bienséance à 2 pas du chat. Tiens, on a découpé une
I am a feminist.
Je vous obsède avec une constance
Je ne me suis pas conduit
qui appelle quand même l'admiration.
d'une façon conforme à ce qu'on attend d'une jeune fille d'abord et d'une femme ensuite.
I'm sorry that I didn't become the world's first black classic
Des
pianist.
femmes artistes, activistes, inspirantes, politiques, des femmes puissantes.
Je crois qu'une femme qui existe dans son temps, à l'intérieur de son temps, n'a pas d'époque, elle
Bienvenue
marque son époque.
dans la
Boum.
poudre. I am Lauren Bastide, and today my guest is Paul B. Preciado.
We got out together. A multitude of bodies on the streets. The first ones to be there were the non-white bodies, in a great anti-necropolitical assembly. Bodies saying no to violence, to sexual violence, to racial, gender violence, state, police violence.
Is this the sound of backlash? Or the sound of revolution? This is July 2020 and we're on the brink of change. My mind is swinging between a vibrant hope and the worst pessimism. Frankly, I'm lost. I find peace in reading, in other people's thinking, particularly the one of my guests today. But before anything, a tiny disclaimer. La Poudre was thought as a safe space to discuss sexist mechanism through the experiences of the ones who live it. Up to now, only women's voices, cis or trans, have been heard in La Poudre. It goes without saying that both non-binary people and all trans people belong here. Paul B. Preciado's work is crucial to understand today's feminist movement and to question gender representation as we have been doing here for 4 years now. Have a good listen. Try to take a step away from the howling noise of the world and to take care of what's important. Your health, both physical and mental, your well-being, your sleep, your family, of blood or at heart. And this is also self-advice, you know? Whew, what a year. Now, see you soon for season 5 of La Poudre. I promise it will be more revolutionary than ever.
Qui, je vous le promets, sera plus révolutionnaire que jamais.
With Paul B. Preciado, we talked about bodies, monsters, and joy.
Paul B. Preciado,
you're a philosopher and a writer. You're also, and I'm being really objective here, the intellectual with the sharpest, the most complex, the most fascinating analysis of our chaotic times. Half biopolitical dystopia and half transfeminist revolution. I'm very honored to have you in La Poudre today.
Hello, thank you very much. You're being excessively generous. Not at all. I'm only trying to do my best to think like anyone would do. That's it, thank you.
So, you've just published a striking essay called Je suis un monstre qui vous parle, I'm a monster talking to you, which is actually a speech you tried to give a few months ago in front of a college of psychoanalysts. Before this, you've written many other essays over 20 years. Among them, the Contrasexual Manifesto, Testo Junkie, and of course an apartment on Uranus, which all left a profound mark on today's political thought, both in and out of France. But before we talk about your life and work, I'd like to address the elephant in the room, or rather, in the podcast. You are not a woman, Paul Preciado. You're, at least in the eye of state, a trans man, even though I believe you define yourself in a more complex way than that. In La Poudre, for 4 years now, I've invited only women because I tried to create a safe space here. However, I think that your words and your experience are essential to understand the stakes of today's feminism. And I think that you belong in this podcast. Do you agree?
Pourquoi pas, oui.
Why not? Yes. It's true that I've been invited a few times in women-only contexts.
Dans lesquels il y a que des femmes, c'est-à-dire des femmes. Et ce qu'on entend habituellement par des femmes, c'est-à-dire...
And by women, I mean what we usually mean, which is bodies assigned as female, both in sex and gender. Since in France, we have a hard time making the difference. At least, the law doesn't make the difference at all.
Donc, femme à la naissance.
So women, assigned female at birth, and it's true, I often find myself in literary festivals or in gatherings with artists or curators or philosophers, invited amongst women.
Parmi les femmes. Et bon, je suis bien, je suis ravi.
And well, I'm very happy. I feel good.
Mon espace, ma culture de résistance politique. C'est-à-dire que j'étais
I belong in this particular space. It's my starting point for political opposition since I was born a woman.
Désidentifié de cette assignation en tant que femme et suis devenu progressivement ce que je suis aujourd'hui.
I was assigned female at birth, and then gradually I stopped identifying myself with what I had been assigned, and I became who I am now, meaning, to contemporary medicine and law, a transsexual man.
Mais je ne me sens pas évidemment un homme.
Obviously, it doesn't say transsexual on my passport, it only says male. But of course, I don't feel like a man amongst other men or a man like all other men since I publicly talk about my dissenting position in terms of gender and sexuality. So in that sense, of course, I'm much closer to women, to bodies that have been assigned female at birth, ever to trans women and non-binary bodies. Much closer to them than to male bodies, assigned male who believe in, let's say, the natural quality of such an expression of masculinity. So yes, why not? I'm perfectly well here, in your space, surrounded by women. Of course.
Bon, tant mieux, vous êtes le bienvenu en tout cas. La dernière fois que je vous ai vu, Paul, c'était à Beaubourg, à Paris, où vous avez commencé en...
Good, you're most welcome here. Last time I saw you, Paul, it was in Beaubourg, in Paris, where you started in March a series of conferences and performances around Michel Foucault's history of sexuality. Much to my regret, it remained unfinished because of the coronavirus crisis. It was incredible, because during the first conference we were starting to feel the threat of the pandemic and lockdown. It was a blurry perspective, but you saw right away what was going to happen. You talked about surveilling, punishing, excluding colonized body, and in the end it all happened according to your predictions.
Je sais pas si à mes prédictions, mais c'est vrai que, en tout cas...
I don't know about my predictions, but it's true. I understood the exceptional occasion I had on that day. There were a lot of people, so I had a responsibility. 600 people were there.
Voilà, il y avait 600 personnes qui étaient là.
And there was an extraordinary energy. I felt indeed this revolutionary urge, really. And I was extremely happy to be a part of it and to be able, in a way, to get all these people together. But at the same time, I understood, well, I had been traveling a lot to Taiwan, for example, and that's how I got infected with COVID. So I understood we were in a situation that was going to prove very complicated in the coming months. I hadn't anticipated a complete lockdown at all, in the way that it happened sometimes later. But it seemed to me that seminars gathering 600 people were going to become very complicated to organize. And that's what happened right away. And what's interesting is that traditional spaces of knowledge production, such as schools and universities, but also spaces producing historical memory, such as museums and traditional institutions, prisons, businesses, etc., the spaces Foucault defined as disciplinary institutions, they collapsed during the COVID-19 crisis. So we witnessed what we couldn't even imagine, because in a way, Foucault had, including in his analysis of the plague, he had analyzed or even anticipated this withdrawal into domestic space. But I think he couldn't have imagined the closing down and almost collapsing of these disciplinary institutions. We still see it today. People have difficulty going back to school, to university, to reopen museums, and what will happen to the theaters? So obviously, it's a whole lifestyle that's being questioned today, and that we will need to change, yes.
Ouais, puis vous aviez aussi une approche.
In this seminar, you also questioned Foucault and tried to add to his work what was lacking, which is anti-racism and feminism. And you talked about this hierarchy of the bodies that we really witnessed during lockdown. Non-white bodies were much more exposed than white bodies. Female bodies were much more constricted than male bodies. I feel that you really, in just one seminar, pushed the idea very far, and reality ended up matching it.
Si le réel l'avait pas rattrapé, quoi.
Ah, j'en sais rien, mais c'est vrai que je voulais faire une nouvelle. C'est pour ça que j'ai appelé ça une nouvelle.
I don't know about that, but it's true. I wanted to make a new... That's why I called it A New History of Sexuality. In a slightly emphatic style, of course. In all modesty, I thought that the idea was not to negate Foucault, but to realize that there were a number of things Foucault didn't do with his history of sexuality, and that it needed a feminist reading, because actually, the greatest quote-unquote historian of sexuality, mainly in France, but also in other countries if we think of the international influence he had. The great historian of sexuality was a non-feminist historian who completely neglected the history of female bodies and things as important as the invention of the notion of gender in the 40s and 50s. So obviously, it seemed urgent to me to redo a new history. And again, this so-called great historian of sexuality completely neglected colonization and still he worked on France, French history, and especially the 18th and 19th centuries, mostly the 19th century. Can you imagine someone studying the 19th century and neglecting to analyze the effects of colonization, of slavery, and obviously the notion of race? So it seemed to me that we urgently needed a new history of sexuality. Because, indeed, I think we are living a historical moment, very complex. So complex that we need a new grammar, a new language, a new way of thinking the relations between body and power, between subjectivity and revolution. I consider myself to be a follower of Foucault, and I have no problem with it. I think he's a major influence on me, but he's been criticized, questioned, surpassed by questions such as transsexualities, the intersex movement, the non-binary movement, as well as by the radical transformation of biopolitical technologies of production and management of the body and sexuality. That's why, as a philosopher today, I believe we're living in an important moment. Well, as a philosopher, but also as an activist, because...
Of course.
Philosophe, mais aussi activiste, parce que pour moi, enfin, les gens parfois ils me disent mais vraiment quel pessimisme, je suis accablé la situation. Je dis mais attendez. Pour les activistes de genre de la sexualité.
People sometimes tell me I can only be a pessimist. I feel crushed, the situation. And I reply, but wait and see. For gender and sexuality activists, for anti-racist activists like us, we're living through extraordinary times. And it's been years, even centuries, that we've been working on what's happening now. On the contrary, we need to realize collectively the importance of the historical times we're going through, and we need to be able to welcome this revolution. Because the problem is that in the mechanics of the neoliberal regime and in the neoliberal condition as a whole, not only as an economical regime, but as a mode of production of subjectivity, our capacity to desire is being subdued. And that's what we'll have to recreate, that we have to reclaim as our own critically if we want a revolution. Because the first thing we need to do a revolution is to desire a transformation, to desire change. And I think that for the first time after the COVID crisis, we started to see something I had already sensed long before. It seemed for me that, for example, when we gathered in the Centre Pompidou, there was a truly revolutionary atmosphere.
Absolutely.
The demonstration on the 8th of March as also a great revolutionary moment. But then we all felt we were in a dead end. We were thinking, what now? And I think from a counterculture or oppressed point of view, we got out of this crisis, out of the lockdown at least, in the most fantastic way. Voices were raised immediately and bodies came out in solidarity, in want of it. To me, this movement is extremely important. It's probably the largest, definitely the largest we've seen since the 50s and 60s. And it's a movement that is much more complex now. And I think we have to see it as anti-necropolitical movement, which means that we got out together, a multitude of bodies on the streets. Of course, the first ones to be there were the non-white bodies in a great anti-necropolitical assembly. Bodies saying no to violence, to sexual violence, to racial, gender violence, state, police violence. And so we need to imagine new terms for how powers are exercised. But when I say powers, I mean we will need to imagine new terms for relations between body and power, body and subjectivity, that don't rely on terms of violence. And so I think that, well, maybe it's just me, but despite being ill, despite breaking my elbow, I'm completely euphoric. That's it.
You're so enthusiastic, and that's why I love reading you so much. Virginie Despentes refers to this enthusiasm in her introduction to your book An Apartment on Uranus, and that's what makes reading you such a wonderful experience, and that's very precious, because one can get easily carried by pessimism lately. So in La Poudre, we try to go back in time and have a look at our guests' lives and experience. Paul Preciado, you were born in Burgos, in the north of Spain, at a time when dictator Franco was still in power. A time that's not so far away. Sometimes in France, we tend to forget this. How was growing up in that place and context?
Dans ce lieu et dans ce contexte.
Je pense que ça a été définitif et très important pour moi. Et que je pense que ça explique aussi.
I think it was defining for me. I think it may explain the person I am today. My obsession for wanting things to change. Because today, I feel that, for example, don't worry, I'll come back to Burgos. But I feel that today, and since 20 years ago in France, we've progressively been slipping toward more and more fascist and far-right positions. And I'm not only talking about the Rassemblement National and not only about microfascism like Deleuze or Guattari have done. I'm talking about a neoliberal state that will borrow more and more from authoritarian and violent mechanisms, as for some institutions inside the state. And so I don't think I'd be as sensitive to these things if I weren't born in an already fascist culture. That's why what I saw around me, I saw a culture of fear. I saw my whole family being destroyed by the Civil War. In my family, there was a bit of everything, like in any other family. Villages were divided almost completely arbitrarily. So at once, I had grandparents on one side or on the other, but without really having an ideology, who ended up fighting against each other. And so I really saw how fascism could deeply destroy a society, and how part of this society resisted unconceivable techniques of death and violence, and techniques of erasure of memory and history. So I think that's why I get goosebumps at the smallest sign of fascism.
Some kind of ultra sensitivity.
Parce qu'en fait, parfois, ce qui m'arrive en France, si vous voulez, c'est que j'ai l'impression que...
Exactly, that's it. Because sometimes what happens to me in France is that I have a feeling that some of my colleagues, I'm talking about philosophers from my generation whom I met in other occasions, such as philosophical conferences. Well, they too slipped progressively toward the right and far right with positions I find unconceivable. So yes, I think that this is something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. This and the fear that in the case of societies like the Spanish today, but also Italian, Portuguese, Greek societies that lived for a long time with fascism, mostly in the 50s and 60s, and it's the same in Latin America. In conditions of social, political, and economic unrest, we've a great tendency to slip back into fascism, populist, authoritarian nationalism. Since, indeed, the democratic institutions either never really existed or were destroyed during the fascist period. So, you see, that's why I also have that baggage. A revolutionary baggage and a philosophical baggage. And that's why I came to France, because I studied with Derrida and at one time, and I was trained in French philosophy. So to me, the French language and its philosophy were extremely important. But this idea of France that I had when I was a student, this revolutionary and resistance ideal, is very far, I would say, very far, when we have a look at the state France is in today, and mostly the French university. For example, the controversies lately around decolonialism interpreted in France as a form of cultural terrorism.
Yes, Emmanuel Macron accused sociologists of being responsible of the anti-racist protests in France, as if racism wasn't in cause, but the university.
That's it, exactly. There's been a great opinion column from thinkers like Achille Mbembe or Eric Fassin and others in reaction to Macron's speech, in which he made extremely serious declarations, taking stances not so different from Trump's or Bolsonaro's. There's also this tendency in France to talk about Trump as if the US were completely grotesque. But watch out, because in reality, Macron is getting closer to very serious stances, and very similar to Trump's. When we think about France's need to reinstate, recreate, and reconstruct genealogies of resistance, most of all in feminist and anti-racist cultures, and cultures that are critical of colonization, which are all, in France, almost non-existent in universities.
That's it. There's such marginalized voices already. It
Absolutely.
seems absurd to try to silence them where they're still facing
Absolutely.
great
In
difficulties
fact,
to be heard.
that's why I agreed to do the Centre Pompidou's proposal to do something like a large public seminar in the museum as the French university is so sectarian and excluded so much from its courses. Feminist, queer, trans, and anti-racist studies. To the point that today you can become a sociologist, an anthropologist, achieve great things in film studies, etc., without ever having heard of, you know,
Monique Wittig, or...
Yes, exactly. Of Monique Wittig, not having heard of Cherry Morenga and Gloria and Zadula, that's something else. Or even Gail Rubin, but not knowing who Monique Wittig is. So each time I talk about Monique Wittig, people ask me, where was she from? As if she were... Anyway, there's this idea in France that decolonial thought comes from the US and that, you know, the US are so different from France. Just as we used to say before, oh, no, queer thought comes from the US. There's no such thing here. But be careful. Of course, queer thought has only really been a political rereading of French thinkers, among which Foucault, Derrida, but also Irigaray, Kristeva, that were maybe not received as political in France, but that became politicized in the US.
And they've had to cross the Atlantic too. And actually,
Yes.
you've had to cross the Atlantic to discover these thinkers. You've discovered them in New York, didn't you?
In a way, there wouldn't be any queer theory if it wasn't for Judith Butler, for example, wouldn't exist without, let's say, Monique Wittig's The Straight Mind. So, actually, you can't really talk about queer thought and decolonial thought as thoughts that are American or come from American campuses. On the contrary, I'd say that it's a subaltern thought, critical, in minority, both on American and French campuses. So you see, that's why, back at the Centre Pompidou seminar, that's why I wanted to do that seminar outside the university, in a space where there could be activists, but also artists, maybe writers, people from the theater world, from cinema. So, with a real disciplinary horizontality, a cross-disciplinary atmosphere, avoiding this very strong difference that is made in France between thought and political action, art and criticism. I think that all these distinctions are made, all these borders between disciplines are completely obsolete, and that France persists in maintaining them, resisting a deep transformation, a process I call depatriarchalization, process of decolonizing our thought.
À la transformation profonde, en fait, à ce que j'appelle un processus de dépatriarcalisation et de décolonisation de la pensée.
I'd like to go back to your childhood talking about resistance. There is this sentence in your last book. People would expect me to produce an efficient, silent work of gender and sexual reproduction. I should have become a nice heterosexual girlfriend, a good wife, a good mother, or a tame woman. I was trapped. Had I been nailed to the ground, my freedom of action wouldn't have been any smaller. It makes me want to change a traditional question of la poudre for you, a question taken from Simone de Beauvoir. How did you not become a woman?
It's true that this question you often ask in my case is mandatory in a way.
Exactly.
It's more like a user manual for my own life.
Yes.
I don't know. What I do know is that I've never been able to believe in femininity. I've always sensed, since I was a child, the theater of femininity and masculinity around me. It's really... I can't explain why, because I wasn't politically conscious yet. It was a feeling of alienation from this theater of heterosexuality, of masculinity, of femininity that seemed to be impossible to embody. And so I was always a failure facing these norms. I couldn't. I just couldn't. There was always something wrong. And it's true that facing some strategies, some of my friends and colleagues who got caught in these strategies of internal sabotage, which means they tried to embody femininity, but in a dissident way, which is completely possible, by the way. I mean that, as some people accuse me of perverting young people with hormones. But no, well, young people nowadays are perverted by hormones because each time a girl, someone assigned girl at birth, goes to the gynecologist, she goes out with a prescription for the pill. So, in a way, young people are already saturated with hormones, and I have nothing to do with it. However, what I do is changing the prescription in a way. But that's something else, you see? Anyway, I'm not saying that the only way to dissent is taking hormones, or let's say testosterone for people assigned female at birth and becoming trans. Not at all. There are many different strategies of gender and sexual dissent, and so there are many bodies assigned female at birth. For example, assigned female and non-white, etc., who will work with strategies of hyperbolic femininity, for instance, of dissenting femininity, including butch femininity. That's a dissenting form. But there are also forms of femininity, by which I mean embodying femininity, that are ultra-sexualized. The whore is a dissident form. There are thousands of ways to dissent.
Yeah, there are thousands of ways of not becoming a woman, like escaping maternity and heterosexuality.
Exactly. But I wasn't good at any of this. I didn't have, for example, well, I had a jaw problem when I was a child. It was really big, so I was very ugly. It was difficult for me to be feminine. But even in lesbian groups, there was a masculine side to me that was unsettling, yet not masculine enough to correspond to the butch aesthetic. It was a weak masculinity. I don't really know why, but there was something that made it impossible for me to embody either masculinity or femininity. But I didn't have a plan nor a strategy. I didn't know I was trans when I was 4 years old. Even if at 4, I wanted to get a sex change operation. When I was a child, I put money aside for 2 things. To buy a little monkey in a pet store in Burgos who was very unhappy, and I really wanted to buy it. And the second thing was a sex change. In a context in which I hadn't access to any information about it, but I didn't see the sex change as a condition to become a man. I was interested in sex change, but not at all in becoming a man. What I'm trying to say is that today, I'm still struggling to keep what I would call a form of political plasticity. In the same way that we talk about brain plasticity, political plasticity is the capacity to still be able to desire, even against the norm. And it's almost something you need to train. It's more or less what Foucault says about freedom, in a way. Freedom doesn't exist. You have to create it. And so you have to train for it, in a way.
It's a muscle.
Voilà, donc pour ne pas devenir une femme, il faut s'exercer.
Yes, so to not become a woman, you need to train every day because the pressures and norms are everywhere, and we live in a world so compartmentalized that they're extremely difficult to escape. As a trans man, it's also very difficult for me to escape a normalization of my own masculinity.
Propre masculinité.
Aux définitions extérieures qu'on va donner de vous-même. D'ailleurs, c'est ce qui ressort aussi très
By the way, that's very clear in your last book. Even your own identity, which you want to be flexible, non-binary, it's always brought back to being a trans man, which relates back to some specific mental health and medical categories. Even when trying to escape a normalization of your body, you find yourself labeled again. And that's what's at the heart of your rebellion in this book, and also what caused such a turmoil when you made your speech.
Qui a aussi causé un tel émoi quand vous avez prononcé ce discours.
Oui, mais maintenant.
Yes, but now, and that's why I chose to call the book I Am a Monster Talking to You, because I claim this monstrosity.
Je revendique maintenant aussi cette monstruosité.
We've been considered monsters by patriarchal colonial capitalism. When I say we, I actually mean non-male bodies. Women, sexualized bodies, non-white bodies, homosexual bodies, disabled bodies, etc. We've been considered to be in a space, a kind of anti-space between humanity and animality. And we're at risk at any moment to topple back into animality. So what I've tried to do, facing the usual strategies of integration and normalization, was to defend at all costs our position and our culture inside the dominant heterosexual binary culture, or even inside white supremacy culture. What I tried to do was to say no. What I would like to do, actually, is to be able to talk from this monstrosity and understand it. Take it as an extraordinary political force that will allow a real transformation. Since the revolutionary transformation we're talking about won't come from any integration in dominant heterosexual culture, nor in dominant white culture, nor in binary culture. In this strict division between the masculine and the feminine. What we need, and that's why I use the idea of the monster, along with Donna Haraway, in order to collectively imagine new possibilities, is something that won't be in this division between homosexual and heterosexual, black and white, masculine and feminine. What would a world, a society in which we would have completely transcended divisions between sexes, genders, races, organizing all power and cultural relations look like? And so that's why I think it's very important to ask ourselves, who has been talking until now?
Exactement.
Voilà,
c'est exactement là que je voulais en venir parce que vous êtes
That's exactly where I wanted us to go, because you're a philosophy PhD. You studied in New York with Derrida and Butler. You come from university, a place where you're put in a position of authority. And you often say that this PhD, has generated more respect and deference around you than you've ever had. But what's interesting in your work, and you've been addressing it since your earliest works, like in 2008 with Testo Junkie, and even before that, is that you talk from your own point of view. You chose autofiction as your literary genre. It seems that claiming this I, your subjectivity, and sending packing this pseudo-neutral objectivity of research is maybe your most political gesture as an academic. Isn't the I what allows you to describe these new possibilities you're describing?
Docteur en philosophie. Et est-ce que c'est pas ce jeu qui permet de faire émerger cet imaginaire que vous décrivez?
La question, c'est que, en fait, je dirais en fait que ceux qui occupent la position de la suprématie, de la domination, n'ont pas besoin de jeu.
The ones who are in positions of supremacy or domination don't need the I because they're in the universal position, so they don't have to say I.
Vous voyez ce que je veux dire en fait, c'est
Because when they're talking, their words are already considered objective.
parler.
So, do you see what I mean? It's more complex than that. It's not only that I chose to talk about, for example, autofiction as a strategy. Well, philosophers, and when I say philosophers, I mean up until the 20th century, until Hannah Arendt, almost all philosophers, and even until Simone de Beauvoir, are male philosophers and whose heterosexuality isn't questioned. But someone like Foucault, someone like Roland Barthes, never explicitly mentioned their sexuality, not even in the history of sexuality, not even in Barthes' works on love, even if today we can see it there. But they didn't take any strong stance, speaking as people considered to be homosexual or, well, on the other side, many feminists and lesbian feminists and black feminists and thinkers. I'm thinking mostly about Audre Lorde, Monique Wittig, Amy Césaire, Glissant, Angela Davis. Obviously, it's not that I chose autofiction as my genre. The problem is that I can't be in the position of the universal subject because if I am, I put myself at risk of mixing my thought with hetero-patriarchal and colonial thought. And so, obviously, if your word is political, there is no other way. It's what Donna Haraway calls situated thought. There is no other way. I have to talk from my own position. But at the same time, every time I say I, it's not necessarily me. Do you see what I mean? Actually,
Of
the
course.
question is...
It's the only possible political
Yes,
writing.
exactly. That's it. This I is a political I. It's not a subjective I. And even if I write in the first person a lot, I'm not narrating everything I do. For example, in my last book, I'm a monster talking to you. The I use refers to the political genealogy of those who, like me, tried to live outside of binary gender divisions and who were medically considered as monsters, as grotesque bodies, as mentally ill, as psychotic bodies or suffering from gender dysphoria, etc. But it's very important, and I want to thank you for asking that question because it's often that you find this easy opposition between on one side, philosophers who don't need the I because they're supposedly objective, and on the other side, well, yes, women, feminists, trans, non-white people that can't avoid using the I. No, we can't, because it's the place from where we can have a political speech that will allow us to deconstruct this pretense of universality that is traditional Western philosophy. And since there's no objectivity, which means that most philosophies are embodied by heterosexual masculine body or a body that will assume that position and avoid involving their own political experience, which are extreme cases like Foucault's or Barthes, or even quantities of, we could make a whole new podcast, thousands of podcasts about it, quantities of lesbian women who are still closeted and, until very recently, completely put their sexuality aside to be able to structure a speech, philosophical or not. So it's still, and I'm still waiting for I'm calling from the bottom of my heart for a situated lesbian thought. That's it. And that's why I claim myself to be a follower of Monique Wittig. It's because it was extremely difficult for Wittig to write something like The Lesbian Body the way that she did. And she paid dearly for it. After that, she was more or less forgotten from literature, from the history of French literature, and she moved to the US and died there as a completely unknown writer.
It's interesting to compare the lives of Monique Wittig and Simone de Beauvoir. Simone de Beauvoir was, I believe, a lesbian too, but she always presented herself as an heterosexual with Sartre. And I think maybe her couple maybe prevented her from being erased from history. Well, that's something quite unsettling here.
I wouldn't say Simone de Beauvoir was lesbian because, to me, lesbianism is also a political stance.
Yes, of course.
And so, actually, I believe that, unfortunately, Simone de Beauvoir was...
Well, she's had mistresses.
Yes, but Simone de Beauvoir was above all lesbophobic, even though she could have a sexuality with women. Do you see what I mean?
Of course.
To me, being a lesbian is also a speech position, meaning a political position. If you're not capable of taking this political position, it doesn't matter what you do in bed or who you do it with, or with who you do it. Do you see what I mean? So this relationship between writing and sexuality, between politics and sexuality, between production of knowledge and sexuality is very complex. And what's interesting now is that we're starting to understand that autofiction doesn't mean talking about yourself. People will say it's self-centered. No. For example, what I find interesting in I'm a Monster Talking to You is how trans and non-binary bodies have been reduced to being monsters, animals, pathologies, medical cases, and criminals. And this genealogy is a political genealogy. Of course, it's extremely important in my life, but my book is not a psychological narration. Do you understand?
Yes, of course, that's what I meant. There is this sentence in your book which I believe sums up all the ongoing minority struggles. Not medicine, nor the law, nor psychoanalysis, nor psychiatry acknowledge my body's right to express itself with expertise about its very own condition. I believe it repeats what you've just been explaining, which is that for the oppressed, there is no other choice than to speak from their own point of view about yourself, to prevent any exterior speech from describing, defining you.
Exactly. But you see, from a philosophical point of view, it's extraordinary. I think it's one of the most beautiful things, in fact, philosophically and politically. How can I explain this paradox? We've been constructed, I'm saying we, for we're a very large group of bodies, if you include children's bodies or feminized bodies, so women's bodies, bodies that are considered as homosexual or to be mentally ill, disabled, etc.
Handicapés, etc. Les corps ouvriers aussi.
The working class bodies too, non-whites. So we're starting to see a very large scene of political bodies. That's what I call somatopolitics. And the beautiful philosophical question is, knowing that historically we're the result of a construction conceived by the political forces in power, in which we're bodies without reason, without a voice, non-subjects, only objects of violence, of alienation, from power, for instance, objects of the productive forces for the working class body, of the reproductive forces for women, or both, objects of all life forces for non-white bodies. How is it possible, in these conditions of complete destruction of our bodies and subjectivity, that we're still able to have a voice and speak for ourselves? Do you see what I mean? To create our own conditions for speech and to raise our voice and say, no, I'm not what you have made of me. That's remarkable. So it means that the biopolitical process of normalization, as well as the process of production of subjectivity, doesn't work completely. And that's where I think that queer feminist philosophy, like Judith Butler's, has transformed and made Foucault's thought much more complex. Because actually, you can imagine a very close relationship between power and subjectivity. Since power will oppress people and produce bodies, feminized, homosexual, trans bodies. But the thing is, these bodies are capable of resisting, of criticizing, of rebellion, including of transforming the power structures through language, of imagining a solution. That's what I'm calling for in my book, I Am a Monster Talking to You. A solution. That's what I wanted to share with my audience and my readers. There's almost, unfortunately, I have to say, almost, a solution. And this solution, we still have to create it collectively. And to create it, we need techniques, close to artistic ones, by which I mean imagination. That's why I'm always working with artists, and why I'm always going back to art and literature. For instance, I went back to Kafka in this book, because for me, philosophy is what Donna Haraway calls non-fiction speculation. Do you see what I mean? It's an art of non-fiction, but in which the forces at play are the forces of imagination.
It's funny because this paradox, it seems to me that you can also find it in your idea of body as a somatic library, which means that the body, which can be seen as biological, very real, very non-fiction, is at the same time associated with all history, all culture, and every single construction. And you pour a whole set of images in each of these bodies. I feel that we can find here this kind of paradox, not really a paradox, actually.
Yes, that's it exactly. The problem is that, unfortunately, capitalist, patriarchal, colonial thought decided the body was an object. It made the body into an anatomical object, often reduced to its production force, or, in the case of feminine body, to this kind of violent coincidence between the female body and the reproductive system. That's an extraordinary diminishing of the female body to its uterus. So we have to try to make the notion of body more complex at all cost. Somewhat like Freud did. I'm very critical of psychoanalysis as a clinical practice, but I'm a big reader of Freud, whose philosophy I enjoy very much. And so we have to do the same as Freud did when he started to explore the unconscious and thought at once, so the mental system is much more than just consciousness. Well, I'd say exactly the same thing, and that's what I call the somatic system. It's much more than just the body. The body, unfortunately, has been reduced to an anatomical object by medical and juridical thought and all Western epistemology. But, in fact, there is something I call the somatic library, and that's much larger than the body as an anatomical object. And it's a political archive, entirely constructed from representations, images, speeches, and institutions. And so it's constantly being constructed and remade. For instance, think about the body. We tend to reduce it to its physicality, but even this we don't know much about. Feminist thought of the last 10 to 15 years has allowed a great transformation of our representation of the clitoris. I'm giving you this example because our audience can ask themselves, how do we imagine the clitoris today?
Peuvent penser justement à comment on va représenter aujourd'hui les clitoris. Eh bien, cette représentation, cette nouvelle représentation...
Well, this representation, this new representation, has opened a whole new space. A political space radically different from the one constructed by the 19th century's thought and anatomical studies. I would say the same thing about the trans body, which I find fascinating. Not only because it's the body I happen to live in, but because it doesn't belong in dominant anatomical cartography, in dominant political anatomy. Trans bodies, like intersex bodies, non-binary bodies, didn't exist in dominant political cartography of anatomy. So we'll decide that there are only male and female bodies, and we'll define them with criteria mostly related to their reproductive potential. So I'm going to use a notion I don't use very often. The materiality of trans, intersex, and non-binary bodies didn't exist in representations of anatomy, nor in juridical and institutional representations. And to inscribe it in institutional, anatomical, and juridical representations would change absolutely everything. Everything. And recently, some countries are creating the possibility to register yourself legally as non-binary, or, for example, the Netherlands will separate female and male assignation from the moment of birth.
Qui vont commencer en fait à séparer l'assignation fille et garçon du moment de la naissance.
Ne plus faire mention du sexe sur la carte.
There is no longer a mention of gender on your ID. That's extraordinary.
C'est ce que je demande en fait, c'est ce que je demande depuis des années.
It is. That's what I'm asking for, and it's been years.
Est discriminatoire.
I think that assigning a gender at birth is discriminatory.
Je le crois, c'est-à-dire que de toute façon, on va être en fait, si vous voulez, dans ce que j'appelle en fait.
Anyway, we'll enter in a phase of change, of epistemological shift. epistemological transformation, which also means a transformation of language, representations, knowledge systems that will get us out of the regime of sexual difference. When I say this, obviously, my psychoanalyst colleagues and many philosophers, anthropologists, etc., French and non-French, say, Paul Preciado is mad. Well, let me tell you, I'm sorry, but we said Galileo was mad too when he said the Earth revolved around the sun. And I think that we're in a moment exactly like this one, and we'll see it happen. We'll witness this moment when we'll acknowledge the radical multiplicity of beings and therefore the impossibility of assigning a body male or female at birth. And so once and for all, we'll disconnect the body as human being from any sexual assignment.
We come across with your enthusiasm again. That's so characteristic of your work. And I know where you get it from because you say it often. It's something we have in common. You feel an immense joy by reading those intellectuals and researchers. You've mentioned some of them during the interview, Donna Haraway, Monique Wittig, Angela Davis. It's a real joy to read this text and to see the world through these texts. However, I've listened to some of the interviews you've given recently, and there seems to be such a gap between what you say and what the person in front of you understands of what you say. It makes me laugh sometimes. You know, they introduce you like, well, Paul Preciado, you have those weird ideas.
Stop it.
How do you manage this hiatus between the place you're in and the place you take your devoted readers to, and these people who have never thought about disconstructing the notion of gender?
Vous avez raison, hein, j'étais récemment confronté à ça, notamment beaucoup de
You're right. I've recently faced such situations, mostly during radio interviews, that have been rather violent. But indeed, I think there's a gap in language, in grammar. But I talk a lot about it because, to me, it's a political and institutional responsibility. Where's feminist education in France? Where are queer studies? But I don't mean having queer studies in universities. What I want would be for studies and workshops to be organized in schools, in primary schools, to talk about, because without this, how can we change deeply rooted and interiorized practices of gender violence that start during one's school years? So, obviously, I find myself facing journalists who have an extremely normative eye, very similar to the one I tried to criticize in this college of psychoanalysts during my conference. One of the most important things to me today is that I don't consider myself to be a trans-only or feminist-only or anti-racist-only thinker. No, I'm a revolutionary thinker. Feminist, anti-racist, trans thought, etc. My goal is a profound social transformation. So I won't say no to talking with other people. So I'll have to talk with very conservative psychoanalysts, with journalists who never had access to feminist studies. For example, if you arrive in France and people ask you if you know Albert Camus,
tu connais pas Albert Camus, mais par contre en fait on peut très bien
but you can very well talk with someone who's never read, well, maybe knows Angela Davis from her Afro haircut, but who has never read Angela Davis. So they'll stay with a pop image of her, and that's it. So this is the problem. And from there, I'm ready to start a great project of open workshops.
A pedagogical project.
I don't know if it's pedagogical because I have to learn too. And I will learn. So it's not only pedagogical. I would call it the parliament of bodies, since the dominant institutions in which we've been made from subjects into monsters are not working anymore, including parliament. Well, let's change them, all of them, into a parliament of bodies. And we'll come together and start discussing what we need, what tools we need to change the world, to make this great trans-feminist, anti-racist, ecological revolution.
Transféministe, antiraciste, écologiste.
You said I'm not only a philosopher of feminism or of the body, and I think it's true. I think you're a philosopher of joy. It comes back very often. You say it all the time.
This I've never heard before, because no, really not.
Vous le dites tout le temps. Je vous lis.
I've been reading you very carefully for a long time now. And for example, there is this sentence in An Apartment on Uranus. Happiness is being utterly convinced to be alive, is being the witness of one's era, and therefore feeling brutally and passionately responsible for the collective destiny of the planet. This theme of joy and happiness appears very often in your work, and you're always associating this happiness and this joy with the political transformation of society and with activism.
Yes, of course. Because to me, it's not. The problem is, it's not easy in a society like ours to feel really alive. Do you see what I mean? I mean that at times, I meet lots of groups. I speak with lots of young people, trans or non-binary, with families of trans children, or with young people who are sexually dissident, who we would traditionally refer to as homosexual, and they're all going through extremely violent situations. So it's not easy feeling alive. And also because of what we were talking about, how the neoliberal system is making us systematically depressed, putting us in a kind of collective apathy, thinking we can't do anything. That's more or less what was happening after the lockdown, when people were saying, but now everything's going back to how it was, because the question is, how can we reconnect? How can we reconnect with life? What does it mean to be alive? It's so difficult because we're constantly confronted, involved with techniques of death. Because we have to change our whole perception now. That's why I'm calling for an aesthetic revolution, a revolution of perception. Because the problem is, for instance, that consumption was good. Consumption equals success. Same for production. Production equals progress. Let's produce more. So we have to change our perspectives, because consumption is an act of destruction. Production is an act of destruction. It's not an act of progress. It's an act of destruction, of social, political, ecological destruction.
Environmental, yes.
Exactly. And so, for example, I almost don't consume anything because I have no interest in it. I'm interested in the production of my own imagination. I try to resist by any means, by creating stories, texts, images. But other than that, I have no interest in production. I have no interest in consumption, not at all. And it will never make us happy. When I talk of revolution, I talk about this joy of something beginning before our eyes. A joy that starts with saying, but actually, we're alive. Despite this captivity, despite having been the object of a whole lot of techniques of death, we're alive.
Malgré le fait d'avoir été l'objet de tout un ensemble de techniques des morts, nous sommes vivants. Donc, qu'allons-nous faire en fait de cette vie?
So, what are we going to do with this life? With each moment of this life? It's an explosion in a way. It's joy as a political strategy.
Exactly. So you say it made sense to associate you with happiness and joy.
No, but it's true. It's true that it's the first time someone tells me they found happiness in my text, because before, it's true, I've always felt a real generational gap. My readers are very young, and before, older readers would tell me, well, age is also a social construct, so there are conservatives on both sides. But it's true that many people from my generation said to me, your work is very violent. It's really hard. And now I meet people who are 20 years old who tell me, no, not at all. It's really cheerful. Finally, I've had to wait a long time.
You had to wait to be understood. Well, I'm not 20, but I'm 20 in my head. Paul Preciado, how do you get along with your rebel and non-reproductive uterus, as you put it in your book?
Very well. For the moment, I have no problem. There's been a cognitive and sexual re-signification of my uterus, and that's it. It's a trans and very happy uterus.
Excellent. And if I tell you la poudre, the powder, what does it mean to you?
The powder, to me, the first time I heard it, I'm Spanish, so it means anarchism, Barcelona, bomb, explosion. And so the powder, if you can, instead of dropping a bomb, powder is in your voice. Because I think that all revolutions start with the voice. So a revolutionary powder in your voice, this could be powerful.
That's perfect. That's the best definition possible for my work. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure. Paul Preciado, c'est un vrai plaisir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. It was a relief talking to you compared with other interviews I did. That's it. See you soon.
Thank you to Paul B. Preciado for speaking up in La Poudre. Nouvelles Écoutes is the executive producer of La Poudre, a podcast produced by Aurore Meyer-Mailleux. Thanks to Lucie Pleskov for the translation and to Rafi Wofsi for his voice in English. The English dubbing is made by Laurie Galigani and mixed by Marion Emery.